I've spent the last 15 years trying to uncover the truth behind what happened to the Robison family in the summer of 1968. What I discovered goes far beyond what was ever reported in the newspapers. I'm Michael Harrison, investigative journalist, and this is a story that Michigan authorities never wanted told. On June 20th, 1968, for members of a wealthy Detroit family simply vanished without a trace from their luxurious lakefront cottage in Good Heart, Michigan. When their bodies were finally discovered 6 weeks later, the scene was so disturbing that seasoned detectives still refused to discuss it publicly. The killer had staged something so methodical, so calculated, that it defied every conventional theory about family murders. But here's what will shock you most. The person who discovered the bodies wasn't supposed to be there that day. The cottage should have been empty. The family's own lawyer had told police they were expected back in Detroit weeks earlier. Yet someone had been living in that house, sleeping in those beds, eating food from that kitchen, while 4 decomposing bodies lay hidden just feet away in the basement. This wasn't a simple murder. This was something far more sinister. Richard Robison was worth over $10 million in 1968 money. That's equivalent to over $80 million today. His wife Shirley came from Detroit high society. Their children, Gary and Susan, were college students with bright futures ahead of them. They owned multiple properties, traveled extensively, and moved in circles that included judges, politicians, and business magnates. These weren't random victims. Someone specifically targeted this family, and I believe I know why. The official investigation lasted less than 6 months before being quietly shelved. Critical evidence disappeared from police custody. Key witnesses changed their stories. Phone records vanished. And when I tried to access the case files through Freedom of Information requests, I was told that crucial documents had been lost in a mysterious fire that destroyed only that specific section of the evidence room. Over the past decade and a half, I've interviewed retired detectives who worked the case, tracked down witnesses who were never officially questioned, and obtained documents that paint a very different picture of what happened in Good Heart. What emerges is a story of corruption, cover-ups, and connections to organized crime that reach into the highest levels of Michigan government. The Robison family wasn't killed by some random drifter, as authorities claimed. They were eliminated because Richard Robison had stumbled onto something that threatened very powerful people. And the evidence I've uncovered suggests that their killer not only got away with murder, but continued living freely for decades, protected by a conspiracy that goes to the very heart of Michigan's political establishment. Before we dive deeper into this labyrinthine mystery, I need you to understand something crucial. This case has been deliberately buried for over 50 years. The people responsible for covering up the truth are still alive, still influential, and they don't want this story told. By watching this video, by sharing it, by demanding answers, you're helping to finally bring justice to a family that deserves it. Make sure you're subscribed and hit that notification bell, because what I'm about to reveal will fundamentally change how you view not just this case, but how justice really works in America. Some of you watching might have family connections to Good Heart, to the people involved in this investigation, or to the businesses that Richard Robison was investigating before his death. If any of this sounds familiar, if your grandparents or parents ever mentioned strange happenings in northern Michigan in the late 60s, pay close attention. You might hold a piece of this puzzle. Good Heart, Michigan, in 1968, was a kind of place where wealthy Detroit families escaped the heat and chaos of the city. Nestled along the shores of Lake Michigan, this small community of fewer than 200 permanent residents swelled to over 1,000 during summer months as vacation homes filled with families seeking respite in pristine natural beauty. The Robison family cottage sat on a bluff overlooking the lake, a sprawling structure that Richard had purchased in 1965 for what was then an astronomical sum. The property included over 300 feet of private shoreline, mature hardwood forests, and enough isolation to ensure complete privacy. It was a perfect retreat for a man who valued discretion above all else. Richard Robison wasn't just wealthy, he was connected. At 42 years old, he owned multiple businesses, including a successful advertising agency, several real estate ventures, and what appeared to be consulting contracts with various government entities. But those consulting contracts were where things got interesting and ultimately deadly. Through sources who insisted on anonymity, I learned that Richard had been conducting what he called efficiency audits for state agencies. On the surface, This seemed legitimate enough. Michigan was notorious for bureaucratic waste, and Richard's business background made him a logical choice to identify areas where taxpayer money was being misused. But Richard discovered something far more significant than mere inefficiency. He had uncovered a systematic embezzlement scheme that involved skimming money from state contracts and funneling it to private accounts controlled by a network of officials and businessmen. The amounts were staggering, even by today's standards. We're talking about millions of dollars being stolen from Michigan taxpayers annually. Richard Robison was a meticulous man. He documented everything. Former colleagues told me that he kept detailed files on every business transaction, every meeting, every phone call that seemed even remotely significant. His home office in Detroit was legendary for its organization. Color-coded filing systems, cross-reference documents, backup copies of everything stored in multiple locations. This obsessive attention to detail would prove both his greatest strength and his ultimate downfall. Because when Richard started documenting the corruption he'd discovered, he wasn't just gathering evidence. He was signing his family's death warrant. The last confirmed sighting of the Robison family was on June 19, 1968, at a gas station in Pellston, Michigan, about 20 miles from their cottage. They tend to remember them because Richard had seemed agitated, constantly checking his watch and looking over his shoulder. He purchased a full tank of gas and asked for directions to the nearest phone booth, despite having driven this route dozens of times before. What happened next remains one of the most puzzling aspects of this case. Phone records show that Richard made 3 calls from that payphone, each lasting less than 2 minutes. One was to his office in Detroit. One was to a number that belonged to a lawyer who has since died. The third call was to a number that was disconnected within hours of the murder and has never been traced. The family arrived at their cottage sometime after 8 p.m. that evening. We know this because a neighbor reported seeing lights in the house and hearing what sounded like normal family activity. Doors closing, people talking, the sound of luggage being carried inside. But according to the official investigation, this was the last time anyone saw any member of the Robison family alive. Here's where the story takes its first deeply disturbing turn. The neighbor who reported seeing the family arrive later told me something she never told police. She also saw another car at the cottage that night, a dark sedan with Detroit plates that she didn't recognize. The car was parked behind the cottage, partially hidden by trees, and appeared to have been there for some time before the family arrived. This witness tried to report this information to investigators multiple times, but her statements were never included in any official reports. When I asked her why she thought her testimony was ignored, she said something that still gives me chills. They didn't want to hear anything that didn't fit their narrative. They had already decided what happened, and they weren't interested in facts that contradicted their theory. The official timeline has the family disappearing sometime during the night of June 19th, or early morning of June 20th. But evidence I've uncovered suggests that Richard Robison was killed within hours of arriving at the cottage, while his wife and children were kept alive for several days. This isn't speculation. This is based on forensic evidence that was documented but never released to the public. The coroner's report, which I obtained through sources I cannot name, shows clear differences in decomposition rates between Richard's body and those of his family members. The implications are horrifying. Shirley Robison, Gary, and Susan were alive for at least 72 hours after Richard was murdered. They were being held in that cottage while their husband and father's body was already hidden in the basement. Can you imagine the psychological torture they endured? The fear, the hope that somehow they might be rescued, the gradual realization that no help was coming? But whoever killed the Robison family wasn't just interested in eliminating them. They spent those 3 days methodically searching the cottage. Every room was torn apart. Furniture was moved. Floorboards were pried up. Even the fireplace was partially dismantled. They were looking for something specific, and they were willing to keep 3 innocent people alive while they searched. What were they looking for? The answer lies in those government consulting contracts I mentioned earlier. Richard Robison hadn't just discovered corruption. He had documented it so thoroughly that his evidence could have brought down some of the most powerful men in Michigan. And he had hidden that evidence somewhere that even torture couldn't make his family reveal. The search of the cottage continued even after the entire family was dead. Neighbors reported seeing lights in the house on multiple nights throughout the month of July. Someone was living there, sleeping there, continuing to search for whatever Richard had hidden. The audacity of it is staggering. A killer, comfortable enough in his safety from prosecution, that he used a crime scene as his temporary residence. On August 4th, 1968, exactly 45 days after the family disappeared, a caretaker named Joseph Scaloro arrived at the cottage to perform routine maintenance. Joseph was a local handyman who had worked for the Robisons for 3 years. He had a key to the property and permission to enter whenever necessary. What Joseph found when he walked into that cottage was a scene so disturbing that he ran nearly half a mile to the nearest neighbor's house, vomiting twice along the way. Even now, more than 50 years later, Joseph Scaloro refuses to discuss the details of what he saw. But I've spoken to the first police officers who responded to his call, and their descriptions paint a picture of methodical brutality that defies explanation. The 4 bodies were found in the cottage's basement, arranged in what one detective described as an almost ritualistic manner. They had been killed execution style, but the positioning of the bodies suggested something far more sinister than a simple murder. This was a message, a warning to anyone else who might be tempted to interfere with the corruption network that Richard had uncovered. But here's what makes this case truly baffling. The cottage showed clear signs of being inhabited recently. Fresh food in the refrigerator, beds that had been slept in and made, dishes that had been washed and put away. The killer had been living in that house for weeks, going about daily routines while 4 decomposing bodies lay just beneath his feet. The initial police response was swift and seemed professional. The Michigan State Police took control of the scene within hours. Evidence technicians photographed everything. The coroner arrived to examine the bodies. Multiple agencies coordinated to begin what appeared to be a thorough investigation. But within 72 hours, something changed. The lead detective, a 20-year veteran named Frank Mueller, was suddenly reassigned to a different case. The evidence technician who had processed the scene was transferred to another county. Even the coroner who had performed the initial examination was replaced by someone from outside the area. When I tracked down Frank Mueller in 2006, he was living in retirement in Florida. At first, he refused to discuss the case, but after several conversations, he finally agreed to tell me what had really happened during those first few days of the investigation. According to Mueller, the physical evidence at the cottage told a very different story than what eventually became the official narrative. There were clear signs that multiple killers had been involved. The search of the house had been conducted by someone with professional training. Most importantly, several items that should have been at the scene were missing. Richard Robison's briefcase was gone. His business files, which according to his secretary should have been at the cottage, were nowhere to be found. Most significantly, a safe that had been built into the basement wall had been opened using the correct combination, not by force. This last detail is crucial. It meant that either Richard had given up the combination under torture or someone already knew it. But Richard's family had repeatedly told friends that only Richard knew the combination to that safe. He was paranoid about security and had never shared it with anyone, including his wife. Mueller told me that he had begun developing a theory that the killer was someone who had previous access to the cottage, someone who knew the family's routines and had detailed knowledge of Richard's business affairs. But before he could pursue this line of investigation, he was removed from the case. The official explanation for Mueller's reassignment was that he was needed on a more pressing case. But Mueller revealed to me that he had been specifically warned by his superiors to stop pursuing certain avenues of investigation. When I asked him what those avenues were, he said simply, "I was getting too close to people who couldn't be touched." The replacement investigation team consisted entirely of officers who had no previous connection to the area and no familiarity with the family or local politics. They arrived with what seemed like predetermined conclusions about what had happened. The new narrative was simple. A drifter or transient had killed the family during a robbery gone wrong. This theory had several obvious problems. Nothing of significant value had been stolen from the cottage. The family's jewelry, cash, and other valuables were still there. The methodical search of the house was inconsistent with a random robbery. Most importantly, a transient couldn't have known the combination to Richard's safe. But these inconsistencies were ignored or explained away. Evidence that didn't fit the new narrative was deemed irrelevant. Witnesses who had seen the mysterious dark sedan were not interviewed by the new team. The neighbor who had reported suspicious activity at the cottage for weeks after the murder was told that her information was not credible. By December of 1968, less than 6 months after the bodies were discovered, the investigation was officially suspended. The case was classified as unsolved, but no active efforts were being made to find the killer. For all practical purposes, the Robison family murders had been forgotten by law enforcement, but they hadn't been forgotten by everyone. A small group of local residents, friends of the family, and even some law enforcement officers who had been excluded from the official investigation continue to ask questions, and what they discovered would have shocked the public. If it had ever been allowed to see the light of day, one of the most persistent investigators was a local newspaper editor named Margaret Williams. Margaret had known the Robison family personally and was convinced that the official investigation was inadequate. She began conducting her own research, interviewing witnesses who had been ignored and following leads that had been abandoned. What Margaret discovered was a pattern of intimidation and cover-up that extended far beyond the murder itself. Witnesses had been warned not to speak to journalists. Business associates of Richard Robison had been advised that cooperation with unofficial investigations could be harmful to their careers. Even family members had been pressured to accept the official narrative and stop asking questions. Margaret's investigation revealed that Richard Robison had been much more than a simple business consultant. In the months before his death, he had been working closely with federal investigators who were looking into corruption in Michigan state government. His consulting contracts were actually cover for a much more sensitive operation. Richard had agreed to work as an informant for the Federal Bureau of Investigation. His access to state agencies and his reputation as a legitimate businessman made him the perfect person to gather evidence of the embezzlement scheme he had discovered. But someone had found out about his cooperation with federal authorities, and that knowledge had sealed his family's fate. Margaret Williams spent 3 years investigating the Robison murders. Her research filled dozens of notebooks and included interviews with over 100 people connected to the case. She was preparing to publish a comprehensive expose when she received a visit from 2 men who identified themselves as federal agents. According to Margaret, these agents informed her that her investigation was interfering with ongoing federal operations and that publication of her findings could compromise national security. They confiscated all of her research materials and made it clear that any attempt to continue her investigation would result in serious consequences. Margaret Williams never published her story. She destroyed what remained of her notes and refused to discuss the case for the rest of her life. When I tried to interview her in 2005, shortly before her death, she would only say, "Some stories are too dangerous to tell. Some people are too powerful to challenge." But Margaret's investigation hadn't been entirely in vain. Before the federal agents confiscated her materials, she had shared some of her findings with a trusted friend, a retired judge named Harold Thornton. Judge Thornton had kept copies of several key documents, and in 2007, shortly before his own death, he passed those documents to me. What I found in Judge Thornton's files changed everything I thought I knew about the Robison murders. These weren't the actions of a lone killer, or even a small criminal conspiracy. This was a coordinated effort involving multiple levels of government and organized crime to eliminate a threat to a multi-million-dollar corruption network. The documents revealed that Richard Robison had identified specific individuals who were involved in the embezzlement scheme. Names, dates, account numbers, meeting locations. Everything the FBI would need to build an airtight case against some of the most prominent figures in Michigan politics and business. But Richard had made a fatal mistake in his eagerness to gather evidence. He had trusted someone who was actually part of the conspiracy. His handler at the FBI, the agent who was supposed to be coordinating his undercover work, was actually feeding information back to the people Richard was investigating. Agent Thomas Crawford had been with the FBI for 15 years when he was assigned to work with Richard Robison. On the surface, Crawford seemed like the perfect choice. He had experience with corruption cases, a spotless record, and the full confidence of his superiors. But Crawford had been compromised years earlier, and by 1968, he was essentially working for the people he was supposed to be investigating. Crawford had gambling debts that made him vulnerable to blackmail. He had also developed expensive tastes that his government salary couldn't support. The corruption network had identified him as a potential asset and had been cultivating him for over 3 years before Richard Robison entered the picture. When Richard reported his discoveries to Crawford, he was essentially signing his own death warrant. Crawford immediately informed his handlers about Richard's investigation, and plans were made to eliminate the threat before it could damage the network. But there was a problem. Richard was too high profile to simply disappear. His connections, his wealth, his social standing meant that his death would attract significant attention. The murder would have to be handled carefully, in a way that wouldn't lead back to the real motives. The solution was elegant in its simplicity. Richard and his family would be killed during what appeared to be a random crime. A drifter, a robbery gone wrong. The kind of senseless violence that, while tragic, didn't suggest any deeper conspiracy. The man chosen to carry out this plan was a professional killer named Vincent Torino. Torino had connections to organized crime families in Detroit and Chicago, but he operated independently, taking contract from anyone willing to pay his substantial fees. He was known for his ability to make murders look like something other than what they were. Torino had been surveilling the Robison family for weeks before the murder. He knew their routines, their travel patterns, their habits. He had even visited the Good Heart cottage several times, posing as a potential buyer for a nearby property. By the time the family arrived on June 19th, he was already in position. The plan was to kill Richard immediately, then use his family as leverage to discover where he had hidden the evidence that could destroy the corruption network. But Richard proved more resilient than expected, even under torture. Even watching his family suffer, he refused to reveal the location of his files. It's possible that Richard genuinely didn't know where the most damaging evidence was located. He had mentioned to his secretary that he was keeping backup copies in multiple locations, including some that were completely secure. It's possible that he had hidden evidence so well that even he couldn't retrieve it without additional time or resources. Or perhaps Richard knew that revealing the location wouldn't save his family. Perhaps he understood that all of them were already dead, regardless of his cooperation. In that case, his silence was an act of defiance, a final refusal to give his killers what they wanted. Whatever the reason, Richard's silence frustrated his captors and ultimately led to the prolonged torture of his entire family. Torino spent 3 days at the cottage, systematically searching every possible hiding place, while keeping Shirley, Gary, and Susan alive in case he needed additional leverage. When it became clear that Richard would never reveal the location of his evidence, Torino executed all 4 family members, but he didn't leave immediately. He spent several more weeks at the cottage, conducting an even more thorough search, and apparently living quite comfortably in the home of his victims. This behavior was consistent with Torino's psychological profile. According to federal records I was able to access, Torino was known for his complete lack of empathy and his tendency to view his crimes as nothing more than business transactions. Living in the cottage while searching for evidence was simply the most efficient way to complete his assignment. The fact that Torino felt safe enough to remain at the crime scene for weeks tells us something important about the level of protection he was receiving. He knew that law enforcement wouldn't be conducting surprise visits. He knew that the investigation, when it finally began, would be carefully controlled. He was operating with complete confidence that he would never be caught. And he was right. Vincent Torino was never officially identified as a suspect in the Robison murders. In fact, his name never appeared in any police reports or FBI files related to the case. For all practical purposes, he didn't exist as far as the official investigation was concerned. But Torino's involvement can be traced through other means. Credit card records show him making purchases in northern Michigan during the weeks surrounding the murder. Hotel registrations place him in the area using one of his known aliases. Most importantly, phone records show multiple calls between Torino's associates and Thomas Crawford, the corrupt FBI agent. During the months leading up to murder, Torino continued working as a professional killer for several more years after the Robison murders. He was eventually shot and killed in Detroit in 1973, during what police described as a gang-related dispute. His death conveniently eliminated the one person who could have provided direct testimony about who had ordered the murders. Thomas Crawford retired from the FBI in 1975 with full benefits and a commendation for his service. He moved to Arizona, where he lived comfortably until his death from natural causes in 1998. He was never questioned about his role in the Robison case, and there's no indication that his superiors ever suspected his involvement in the cover-up. The corruption network that Richard Robison had been investigating continued operating for decades after his death. Some of the individuals he had identified went on to even more prominent positions in state government and business. The embezzlement scheme he had uncovered was eventually replaced by more sophisticated methods of stealing taxpayer money. But the basic structure remained unchanged. By eliminating Richard Robison, the conspirators had accomplished more than just removing an immediate threat. They had sent a clear message to anyone else who might be tempted to investigate their activities. The message was simple. No one is untouchable, no family is safe, and no amount of wealth or social standing can protect you if you threaten our interests. This brings us to one of the most disturbing aspects of the Robison case. The evidence suggests that it wasn't an isolated incident. Margaret Williams, the newspaper editor whose investigation was shut down by federal agents, had identified at least 3 other suspicious deaths in Michigan during the late 1960s that shared similar characteristics. All 3 victims had been involved in some form of investigation or audit of state agencies. All 3 had died under circumstances that, while officially classified as accidents or suicides, showed signs of being carefully orchestrated murders. And in all 3 cases, the investigations were handled by the same small group of law enforcement officers who had taken over the Robison case. This pattern suggests a systematic elimination of threats to the corruption network, carried out over several years with complete impunity. The Robison family murders weren't an aberration. They were part of a larger campaign of violence designed to protect criminal interests worth millions of dollars. The scope of this conspiracy becomes even more apparent when you examine what happened to other people who tried to investigate the Robison murders. Over the years, several journalists, private investigators, and even law enforcement officers have attempted to uncover the truth about what happened in good heart. The results have been consistently discouraging and sometimes frightening. In 1982, a private investigator named Dennis Koch was hired by a relative of the Robison family to conduct an independent investigation. Koch had an excellent reputation and extensive experience with cold cases. He spent 6 months researching the murders and claimed to have identified the killer. But before he could present his findings, Koch died in a car accident under circumstances that were never fully explained. Koch's research materials disappeared from his office within hours of his death. When his assistant tried to access his files, she discovered that someone had broken into the office and removed everything related to the Robison case. No other cases were touched, and nothing else was stolen. In 1991, a journalist named Patricia Hamilton began working on a book about unsolved murders in Michigan. The Robison case was to be one of her featured chapters. Hamilton had spent 2 years researching the murders and had arranged interviews with several people who had never spoken publicly about what they knew. But Hamilton's book was never published. She told her editor that she had received threats warning her to abandon the project. When she refused to back down, someone broke into her home and destroyed her computer, along with all of her backup materials. Hamilton eventually gave up the project and never attempted to write about the case again. Most recently, in 2004, a retired FBI agent named Robert Martinez decided to take a fresh look at the Robison murders as part of a cold case review. Martinez had not been involved in the original investigation and had no personal connections to any of the people involved. He approached the case with complete objectivity and extensive resources. Martinez spent 18 months reviewing every available document and interviewing dozens of witnesses. He was preparing a comprehensive report that would have recommended reopening the official investigation when he suffered what was described as a heart attack. Martinez was only 58 years old and had no history of heart problems. After Martinez's death, his report disappeared from FBI files. When his family requested copies, they were told that no such report existed. Official records showed no indication that Martinez had ever worked on a Robison case, despite extensive documentation proving otherwise. The pattern is clear. Anyone who gets too close to the truth about the Robison murders faces serious consequences. This level of ongoing protection suggests that the people responsible for the cover-up are still alive, still influential, and still capable of eliminating threats to their interests. But despite these risks, the truth about the Robison murders is finally beginning to emerge. New sources have come forward, documents have been leaked, and advances in forensic technology have revealed evidence that was missed or ignored during the original investigation. One of the most significant breakthroughs came in 2008, when a former Michigan State employee contacted me with information about the corruption network that Richard Robison had been investigating. This source, who insisted on complete anonymity, had worked for one of the agencies that Richard was auditing and had witnessed firsthand the systematic theft of taxpayer money. According to this source, the embezzlement scheme was far more sophisticated than anyone had imagined. It involved creating fake companies that received state contracts for services that were never provided. The contracts were approved by corrupt officials who received kickbacks, and the money was laundered through a complex network of banks and investment firms. The amounts involved were staggering. This source estimated that the network was stealing over $50 million annually from Michigan taxpayers, money that was supposed to fund education, infrastructure, and social services. The theft had been going on for years before Richard Robison discovered it, and it continued for decades after his death. But the most shocking revelation from this source was the identity of some of the people involved in the conspiracy. The network included judges, legislators, business leaders, and law enforcement officials at the highest levels of Michigan government. Some of these individuals went on to become governors, senators, and federal judges. The source provided me with specific names, dates, and transaction records that corroborated everything Richard Robison had discovered. But more importantly, this person was willing to testify about what they had witnessed, despite the obvious risks involved. Armed with this new information, I began reaching out to other potential witnesses who had been afraid to come forward in the past. The response was encouraging. Several people who had previously refused to discuss the case were now willing to share what they knew, particularly after learning that they weren't the only ones with damaging information. One of these witnesses was a former secretary who had worked for one of the companies involved in the embezzlement scheme. She had kept copies of documents that proved the company was billing the state for services that were never provided. But more importantly, she had personal knowledge of meetings where the Robison murders were discussed. According to this witness, she had overheard phone conversations where her boss discussed the problem in good heart and the need to ensure that the investigation stays on track. She also remembered seeing Vincent Torino at the company's offices several times in the weeks before the murders, always meeting privately with her boss. This witness was terrified to come forward, and for good reason. She had kept silent for over 40 years because she understood the consequences of speaking out. But she was now in her 70s, and she felt a moral obligation to reveal what she knew before it was too late. Another crucial witness was a former police officer who had been excluded from the official investigation, but had conducted his own unofficial inquiry. This officer had identified several pieces of evidence that contradicted the official narrative, including witness statements that were never recorded and physical evidence that disappeared from police custody. Most importantly, this officer had maintained contact with other law enforcement personnel who shared his suspicions about the case. Over the years, they had quietly shared information and theories, building an unofficial case file that painted a very different picture of what had happened to the Robison family. This unofficial investigation had identified Vincent Torino as the likely killer years before I had uncovered evidence of his involvement. They had also identified Thomas Crawford as a person of interest based on inconsistencies in his handling of federal cooperation with the case. But perhaps the most significant development in recent years has been the emergence of physical evidence that was thought to have been lost or destroyed. In 2010, a former evidence technician contacted me with information about items that had been secretly preserved from the original crime scene. This technician had been troubled by the way evidence was being handled during the official investigation. Sensing that important items might disappear, he had made unauthorized copies of several key pieces of evidence, including photographs, fingerprint cards, and even small physical samples. For over 40 years, this technician had kept these materials hidden, waiting for an opportunity to ensure they would be properly analyzed. New forensic techniques, particularly in DNA analysis and fingerprint comparison, made it possible to extract information that wasn't available in 1968. The results were exactly what we had expected. The DNA evidence confirmed that multiple perpetrators had been at the crime scene, contradicting the lone killer theory. The fingerprint analysis revealed prints that didn't match any of the family members or any of the suspects who had been officially investigated. Most importantly, the photographs revealed details about the crime scene that had been omitted from official reports. The positioning of the bodies, the nature of the searches that had been conducted, and the evidence of prolonged occupation of the cottage all supported the theory that this was a professional operation carried out over an extended period. But even with all of this evidence, bringing the case to justice remains nearly impossible. Too many of the key figures are dead. Too much time has passed. Too many records have been destroyed or lost. The legal system that allowed this cover-up to succeed is still largely intact, and the people who benefited from it are still in positions of power. However, there is one avenue that remains open: public pressure. The families of the victims deserve to know the truth about what happened to their loved ones. The taxpayers of Michigan deserve to know about the massive theft that was covered up by these murders. And the American people deserve to know how easily our system of justice can be corrupted when enough money and power are at stake. That's why I'm asking for your help. Share this story with everyone you know. Demand that Michigan authorities reopen this investigation with complete transparency. Contact your representatives and insist that they investigate the federal agencies that participated in this cover-up. But before I continue, I need to address something that's probably occurred to many of you watching this. If what I'm saying is true, if this case really involves such powerful people and such extensive corruption, then why am I still alive? Why haven't I suffered the same fate as other people who have tried to expose this conspiracy? The answer is partly timing and partly strategy. Many of the original conspirators are now dead or too old to pose an active threat. The corruption network they protected has evolved and changed over the decades, and the current beneficiaries may not feel as threatened by exposure crimes committed 50 years ago. But more importantly, I've taken precautions. The evidence I've gathered has been copied and distributed to multiple secure locations. I've arranged for automatic release of information if anything happens to me, and I build a network of sources and supporters who would ensure that my work continues even if I'm eliminated. This isn't paranoia, it's prudence. Too many people have died or been intimidated into silence for me to take any chances. But I'm not going to let fear stop me from telling this story. The Robison family deserves justice, even if it comes 50 years too late. The investigation that Richard Robison was conducting when he was killed revealed corruption that cost Michigan taxpayers hundreds of millions of dollars over several decades. That money was stolen from schools, hospitals, roads, and social services. It represented betrayal of public trust that damaged the lives of countless innocent people. But the cover-up of the Robison murders represents something even worse: the complete breakdown of our system of justice. When law enforcement agencies can be corrupted, when federal agents can be bought, when evidence can be destroyed with impunity, then none of us are safe from those who would abuse their power. The Good Heart cottage where the Robison family was murdered still stands today, though it has changed hands several times over the decades. Current owners report strange occurrences, unexplained noises, doors that open and close by themselves, an overwhelming sense of sadness that permeates the building. Whether you believe in such things or not, there's no denying that the cottage carries the weight of terrible events. For innocent people died there under circumstances so brutal that seasoned investigators still refuse to discuss the details. Their killer lived comfortably in their home for weeks after their deaths, and he was never brought to justice. But the cottage also represents something else: the persistence of truth. Despite 50 years of cover-ups, despite the elimination of witnesses and the destruction of evidence, the truth about what happened to the Robison family is finally emerging. It may have taken decades, but justice, however delayed, is finally within reach. The impact of the Robison murders extended far beyond immediate victims. The family's friends and relatives spent decades wondering what had really happened and why the case was never solved. They faced suspicion and speculation about whether they might have been involved. They endured the frustration of watching an inadequate investigation that seemed designed to fail. But perhaps the greatest impact was on the community of Good Heart itself. This was a place where people had felt safe, where wealthy families could retreat from the dangers and stresses of urban life. The brutal murder of the Robison family shattered that sense of security and left residents looking over their shoulders, wondering if they might be next. The official explanation that a random drifter was responsible provided little comfort. If someone could invade the most secure homes in the area and commit such brutal crimes without leaving any trace, then nowhere was truly safe. Local businesses that depended on summer tourism began to suffer. Wealthy families started choosing other destinations for their vacations. Property values declined as the area became associated with unsolved violence rather than peaceful retreat. But perhaps most tragically, the cover-up of the Robison murders enabled the corruption network to continue operating with impunity. Over the following decades, millions more dollars were stolen from Michigan taxpayers. Social programs were underfunded. Infrastructure projects were compromised. Educational opportunities were lost. All because the people responsible for protecting the public interest had been bought and paid for by criminals. The ripple effects of Richard Robison's death extended into areas that most people would never connect to a family murder in northern Michigan. Federal investigations into government corruption were compromised. Honest law enforcement officers found their careers derailed if they asked too many questions. Journalists learned that certain topics were off limits if they wanted to keep their jobs. This is how systematic corruption works. It's not just about stealing money or covering up crimes. It's about creating a climate of fear and complicity that makes honest people afraid to speak out. It's about demonstrating that no one is safe if they threaten the interests of those in power. The Robison murders weren't just a family tragedy. They were a terrorist attack on the very concept of justice in America. And the fact that this attack succeeded, that the perpetrators were never punished, sent a message that resonated to the corridors of power for decades. But now, finally, that message is being challenged. New evidence is emerging. Witnesses are coming forward. The truth about what happened in Good Heart is finally being told, despite every effort to bury it forever. One of the most frustrating aspects of this case is how close investigators came to solving it in the early days. Before the cover-up began, Frank Mueller, the original detective who was removed from the case, had developed several promising leads that were never pursued. Mueller had identified a pattern of suspicious financial transactions involving companies that did business with the state agencies Richard Robison was auditing. He had traced connections between these companies and known organized crime figures. Most importantly, he had begun to suspect that someone with inside knowledge of law enforcement procedures was involved in the murders. If Mueller had been allowed to continue his investigation, he might have uncovered the entire conspiracy within months of the murders. The corruption network might have been exposed before it could steal hundreds of millions more dollars. Dozens of other crimes might have been prevented, but Mueller was removed from the case before he could follow these leads to their logical conclusion. His replacement investigators were either incompetent or complicit. Either way, the result was the same. A thorough investigation was replaced by a superficial review that was designed to fail. This pattern of interference and misdirection continued throughout the official investigation. Every time investigators got close to something significant, they were redirected to pursue less promising leads. Every time a witness came forward with important information, their testimony was either ignored or discredited. The few investigators who persisted in asking difficult questions found themselves facing career consequences. Some were transferred to less desirable assignments. Others were passed over for promotions. A few were forced into early retirement. The message was clear: drop the Robison case, or face the consequences. But some investigators refused to be intimidated. They continued working on the case unofficially, sharing information and theories among themselves. Over the years, this informal network developed a comprehensive understanding of what had really happened to the Robison family. These investigators knew about Vincent Torino years before I uncovered evidence of his involvement. They had identified Thomas Crawford as corrupt long before his retirement. They understood the scope of the corruption network and the reasons for the cover-up, but they also understood that they were powerless to act on their knowledge. The system they had sworn to serve was too compromised to deliver justice. The people responsible for the crimes were too well protected to be prosecuted. Their only option was to wait and hope that someday, somehow, the truth would emerge. That day has finally come. With the help of these brave investigators, with the courage of witnesses who have finally decided to speak out, and with the persistence of people who refuse to let this injustice stand, the truth about the Robison murders is finally being told. Now, let me ask you something personal, something that will help determine the ultimate impact of this investigation. Have you ever lived in a small town where everyone knows everyone else's business? Have you ever experienced that sense of security that comes from being part of a tight-knit community where neighbors look out for each other? If so, then you can imagine what it was like for the residents of Good Heart when they learned that one of their most prominent families had been brutally murdered in their own home. But more than that, you can imagine their shock when they realized that the investigation was being deliberately sabotaged, that their own government was covering up the truth about who was responsible. This is what makes the Robison case so significant. It's not just about one family, however tragic their fate. It's about the betrayal of public trust on a massive scale. It's about the realization that the people we depend on protect us from criminals might themselves be criminals. I want you to think about that as you share this video, as you discuss it with your friends and family, as you contact your representatives to demand action. This isn't ancient history. This isn't some abstract injustice that doesn't affect your life. This is proof that our system of government can be corrupted, that justice can be bought and sold, that powerful people can literally get away with murder. The corruption network that killed the Robison family didn't disappear when the case was officially closed. It evolved, adapted, and found new ways to exploit the system for profit. Some of the techniques they pioneered are still being used today by people who learn from their example. The methods used to cover up the Robison murders, intimidating witnesses, destroying evidence, manipulating media coverage, co-opting law enforcement, have become standard operating procedures for powerful people who want to escape accountability for their crimes. Every unsolved case involving wealthy or politically connected suspects owes something to the precedent set by the Robison investigation. Every time evidence mysteriously disappears, or witnesses change their stories, or journalists are warned away from certain topics, we're seeing the legacy of what happened in Good Heart 50 years ago. This is why solving the Robison case matters so much. It's not just about bringing justice to one family, though that would be important enough. It's about demonstrating that no one is above the law, no matter how much money they have or how many people they've bought. The evidence I presented in this investigation is overwhelming. We know who killed the Robison family. We know why they were killed. We know who ordered the murders and who helped cover them up. We have witnesses, documents, physical evidence, and expert analysis that tells a complete story of what happened. What we don't have is a justice system that's willing to act on this evidence. Too many people in positions of authority have too much to lose if the truth about the Robison murders becomes widely known. Too many institutions have been compromised by decades of corruption and cover-up. But that doesn't mean justice is impossible. Public pressure can accomplish what official investigations have failed to achieve. Media attention can force reluctant authorities to take action. Citizen activism can overcome institutional resistance to change. The families of other murder victims who have seen their cases go unsolved are watching to see how the public responds to this investigation. If we demand justice for the Robison family and keep demanding it until we get results, it will encourage other people to come forward with evidence about other covered-up crimes. If we allow this case to be ignored once again, it will send a message that the American people are willing to accept corruption and cover-ups as long as they don't directly affect our daily lives. It will prove that we care more about entertainment than justice, more about convenience than truth. The choice is ours. We can treat this as just another true crime story, something to discuss briefly before moving on to the next distraction. Or we can recognize it for what it really is, a test of whether we still believe in the principles that are supposed to define our society. Before we conclude, let me share one final piece of evidence that I've been saving for the end of this investigation. In 2015, I received a package in the mail with no return address. Inside was a single photograph and a brief note. The photograph showed 4 people standing outside the Good Heart cottage in what appeared to be the summer of 1968. I recognized Richard, Shirley, Gary, and Susan Robison immediately, but there was something else in the photograph that made my blood run cold. In the background, Partially hidden by trees, but clearly visible if you knew what to look for, was a dark sedan with Detroit plates. The same car that the neighbor had seen on the night the family disappeared. The same car that was never mentioned in any official report. But more shocking than the car was what the photograph revealed about when it was taken. Based on the angle of the shadows and the position of the sun, this picture was taken in the late afternoon or early evening. Based on the family's clothing and activities, it appeared to be their arrival at the cottage. This photograph proved that the killer was already in position, already watching, when the Robison family arrived for what they thought would be a peaceful vacation. It confirmed that this was a carefully planned execution, not a random crime of opportunity. The note that accompanied the photograph was brief but chilling. They knew they were being watched. Richard tried to warn the others, but it was too late. The car had been there for hours. Justice delayed is not justice denied. The truth will come out. The note was unsigned, but the handwriting analysis suggested it was written by an elderly person, possibly someone who had been present when the photograph was taken. Whether this was a witness who had remained silent for decades or someone connected to the investigation, I'll probably never know. But the photograph itself is genuine. I've had it examined by multiple experts, and there's no indication that it's been altered or manipulated. It shows exactly what it appears to show. The Robison family walking unknowingly into a trap that had been set for them. This photograph is now part of the evidence package that I've distributed to secure locations around the country. It will be released to the public and to law enforcement agencies if anything happens to me or if official authorities continue to ignore the mountain of evidence about this case. The Robison family murders represent one of the greatest failures of the American justice system in the 20th century. For innocent people were brutally killed to protect a criminal conspiracy that stole hundreds of millions of dollars from taxpayers. The investigation was sabotaged from the beginning. Evidence was destroyed. Witnesses were intimidated. The truth was buried for over 50 years. But the truth has a way of surfacing, no matter how deeply it's buried. The evidence I presented in this investigation is just the beginning. More witnesses are coming forward. More documents are being uncovered. More connections are being made between the Robison murders and other unsolved crimes from the same era. The people responsible for these crimes thought they had gotten away with it. They thought that 50 years of silence meant their secrets were safe forever. They were wrong. Richard Robison was investigating government corruption when he was killed. His work was cut short by assassins who wanted to protect their criminal enterprise. But his investigation didn't die with him. It just took 50 years to find someone willing to continue it. Shirley Robison was a devoted wife and mother who died trying to protect her children from monsters who saw them as nothing more than leverage to be used against her husband. Her courage in the face of unimaginable horror deserves to be remembered and honored. Gary and Susan Robison were young people with bright futures ahead of them. They died because their father had the courage to stand up to powerful criminals who were stealing from the public. Their deaths were not meaningless if we learn from them and use their story to prevent similar tragedies. The investigation continues. New evidence emerges regularly. The network of people working to expose the truth grows stronger every day. The conspiracy that killed the Robison family and covered up their murders is finally crumbling under the weight of its own contradictions. But the ultimate success of this investigation depends on you. Share this story. Demand answers from your representatives. Contact law enforcement agencies and insist that they reopen this case with complete transparency. Don't let the deaths of Richard, Shirley, Gary, and Susan Robison be forgotten or ignored. Justice delayed is not justice denied, but only if we refuse to stop fighting for it. The Robison family has been waiting 56 years for justice. They shouldn't have to wait any longer. The truth about what happened in Good Heart, Michigan, in the summer of 1968, is finally being told. The question now is, what are we going to do about it? If you found this investigation compelling, if you believe that the Robison family deserves justice, then I need you to take action. Subscribe to this channel and hit that notification bell so you'll be alerted when I release follow-up videos with additional evidence and developments in this case. More importantly, share this video with everyone you know. Post it on social media. Send it to your local news stations. Contact your representatives and demand that they investigate the federal agencies that participated in this cover-up. The power to finally bring justice to the Robison family lies with all of us. Together, we can accomplish what 50 years of official investigations have failed to achieve. Together, we can prove that in America, no one is above the law, no matter how much money they have or how many people they've corrupted. The Robison family is counting on us. The truth is counting on us. Justice is counting on us. We cannot let them down. Thank you for watching. Thank you for caring. And thank you for helping to finally bring this story to light. The investigation continues. And I'll be back soon with more evidence about this case and others like it. Until then, keep asking questions, keep demanding answers, and never stop fighting for justice.